I'm with the Center for Internet and Society. We've done a long project on looking at digital financial harms, which is not limited to frauds and scams, but also looks at questions of access and exclusion, digitalization, and longer impacts of these processes on persons, particularly from certain vulnerable communities. So this is the project team. We've been working on it for about 2 years now. How do I move the slides? It's just the left one. Okay. So this was a mixed method study where we surveyed about almost 4,000 people across 9 states in 6 different languages, and we also did focus group discussions with about 63 people from persons from diverse gender and sexual identities, elderly persons, persons with disabilities. And essentially the idea was to look at how are these digital financial platforms, whether private or public, are being experienced by different user groups. So just to start off with what were some of the findings from the study, about 6.2% of the respondents in our survey, which is about 234 people, had experienced fraud online. So this is in line and consistent with what some of the RBI stats also share in terms of like demographically, what is the fraud percentage. And if you see here, some of the common ways in which some of these frauds were being enacted was through fraudulent e-commerce websites, online investment platforms, UPI scams. And most of the respondents, what is the point of inflection when people actually realize that the scam has happened is when actually the scammer stops responding. Which is to say, for a long period when that engagement is happening, people don't, or victims don't always realize that they are being scammed or they're in the process of getting defrauded from the perpetrators. In terms of like continuing with what is the modus operandi in ways in which the scams are being enacted, most 46% of our respondents said that they're actually enacted through the victim actually depositing the money to the scammer's account, which is also what we've heard in some of the other instances. And how this becomes a problem, or to problematize this further, is then what is the role of regulatory or law enforcement processes when in many instances the scammer themselves, the victim themselves are willingly putting the money into the scammer's account. For example, we heard from a participant in a focus group discussion in a Hijra community in Patna, who said that they are often lured into saying that if you send us so much money, we will give you more money. And it starts off with this person at already different axes of vulnerability, imagining that they are going to get more money by these initial investments. And when you also target with particular identity groups who are already vulnerable, they face further sort of marginalizations. And then when they also think about accessing law enforcement or the police, there is already existing stigma and biases within those communities when you try to seek help from law enforcement, and therefore often a lot of what we heard was that they don't end up seeking responses from law enforcement agencies as well. So now the question here that I want to ask is like, what's UPI got to do with it? And this is also related to like how much convenience is too much convenience. The point about UPI is that there is it's very like low friction, high convenience, very easily we can spend money and send money, and that's the sort of both the boon and in some instances the curse of the UPI platform, where we saw that a cybersecurity engineer told us that actually the evolution of UPI has also reinstated certain fundamental design flaws where it's made things too easy both for the consumers, but also for bad actors to be able to enact certain kind of scams. And that is also representative in the data that we saw that 52% of the scams were actually through the UPI accounts. Like the emerging challenges around why, and these are some of the expert interviews we did, and I'm sorry that this is so like content heavy, but like to point out to some of the key points that were emerging. One of the things was the surface area for fraud touch points has really increased because there's too many platforms, not just digital financial platforms, but social media, email, messaging, through which you can actually access consumers. There's also the fact that we were talking about briefly in the yesterday session was also that the modus operandi changes every 3 or 4 months. So even if we have done some literacy programs, awareness campaigns, if the MO changes, then the same people are susceptible to the different kinds of frauds that keep emerging. And of course, the question of languages, that social media platforms can't always detect, whether through sophisticated AI techniques or otherwise, languages in local content which are aiming to not always effectively do that. Then I want to also point to 2 user groups, particularly low income and gendered, and this slide is really to think about, yesterday in one of the presentations we heard people losing money to the amount of 2 crores, 3 crores, and of course there is a very rightly pointed emphasis to the scale of scams or the money or the amount of money you've lost. The argument we are making through this paper is also that it's not often just how much money. It's also in relation to your income, your own standards of existence, and that's something that we try to show here. That in Maharashtra, for example, the median financial loss was almost 5,000 INR, but actually the median monthly personal income for respondents in Maharashtra was 10,000. To see that if somebody who's already making very low money to lose even some amount of their money is a significant impact. So the subjectivity of this kind of harms also needs to be thought about when we think about regulatory responses. And this is to also just point to that similar point of emotional distress, where 82% respondents said that they faced anxiety, emotional distress when they lost money, and this was particularly high for elderly participants, who said that 90% of them said that they faced emotional distress. And then quickly to sort of come to this point of gendered risk, and this came up briefly in some of the conversations yesterday as well, is that a lot of the financial mis and disinformation is most definitely gendered, that it is targeted to certain gender identities and it manifests in gendered ways. One of the things that we heard, for example, from a focus group discussion is, of course, the romance scams, where people use online platforms to seek love, but then it ultimately turns to abusive content, where a video is taken and then that is used to then ask for money, and you use those as threats. What we also heard, again similar, was that an expert told us that they do not often end up seeking redress through the police and so on, because many for example, people in the queer community are closeted and they do not want to be outed, and to seek this kind of redress, if they have to go to law enforcement, it means that some of their identities have to be then outed, and ultimately then the scammer gets the better of it and is able to access and get some of these scams enabled. The Leela Rao case, Boom Live has done a fantastic, case study on this, and we love this because it really tells us how a lot of these gendered harms are really manifested. So Leela Rao, as Adrija was sharing yesterday, is a fake influencer who pretended that her goal was to help women become financially independent like herself. And the way in which it was playing was to say that women who are potentially middle class, are homemakers, may not have access to other ways of creating income or generating wealth for the family. You tug at those emotional, psychosocial ideas for womanhood and say that you can then use these investment schemes to make money for the family. And what we saw, through the case that Boom Live did, was that actually a lot of people ended up getting scammed, and then because of the shame and guilt and things that were spoken of yesterday, they didn't actually end up reporting it or end up talking about it to different people, including people in their family. And in Cruel Optimism, for example, Lauren Berland actually talks about these attachments to unattainable dreams, and this is some of these scams actually sell those ideas of unattainable dreams in a certain way. So then what can we do? And for me, I think the question is that, well, digital literacy, media literacy are things, but are important interventions, but we cannot media literacy our way out of this problem. There need to be regulatory responses, and I know that the next line of speakers will talk about things in India, but I want to talk about two quick things that have happened in other jurisdictions. The UK's authorized push payment fraud reimbursement protections, which essentially says that banks and other regulated entities are in fact liable to provide reimbursements for scams that have happened where the victim has, by unknowingly transferred money to the perpetrator. I'm not getting into the details, but essentially the reimbursements can amount to up to £85,000, and this was enacted in 24th October, and they're going to do a review of this in 2025. There's also the Australian Scams Prevention Framework. Again, what this tries to do is hold some duty of care on regulated entities like banks, like payment platforms, to say that you have the liability to take reasonable steps to prevent, detect scams, and then have some sort of redress where when consumers come in, that you are able to provide redress. This does not have a reimbursement policy, but it does talk about certain duty of care that is then on the regulated entities. And I think that's my time. Thank you.